So just tell me, in your estimation, what does this retreat mean?
Well, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, why were the Russians on the Western Bank? Why were they in Kherson City? Because that puts it in context. And they were there in Kherson City because that should have been the launch pad for what Putin calls a Ruskaya Mir, that is, to raise up and gather in the Russian-speaking people, i.e. he needed to go via Odessa to Moldova and get the people from Transnistria. That's why they were there. If you don't have enough combat power, military means to do that, then just having your military power being eroded on the western side is pointless. So from a military perspective, going to the left bank, Ukraine, makes sense. But although makes military sense, it is a political disaster. And it's a disaster because what we've really seen is the break in the strategy bridge between political intent and military power. You can't, on the one hand, say on the 30th of September, we've annexed all these things and we will use all available means to make sure they're part of Mother Russia. And then 6 weeks later, you've left it. That is just absurd. And it's that breakage between the military and political thing which really matters for the future. And it's not a coincidence that you saw the picture of Surovikin and Sir Oigu. They're the four guys, the military, not Putin. He wanted to distance himself from this.
And that's a really interesting point. All of it is interesting, but that last point particularly, Putin is clearly distancing himself, pointing the blame at these guys. But do you think the people in Russia will buy that, or are people beginning to join up the dots, Chip, and sort of think, hang on, he's saying one thing, but another thing's happening on the ground?
Well, Napoleon used to say that he'd rather control a newspaper than a division. And Putin still really controls the narrative in Russia. I mean, there are lots of neo-nationalists who are, befuddled by what's gone on, and you can't make any decency out of the withdrawal across the Kherson. But the civil society bit of Russia is really being effectively ground away by Putin. So you're not going to get a mass of people, which will probably mean that will be some sort of uprising. Now, in historical terms, any country in the world that has a turnout of 3.5% of the population in a peaceful way against a leader leads to some sort of regime change. That will just not happen in Russia. That leaves you with two alternatives to getting Putin out of the way. The first one is elite defections. And it's easy to see why that might happen. That is to do with, military defeats or the economy's in a bad order and all that sort of thing. But the how is more difficult because the FSO, the Federal Protection Agency, is very strong. The military have no role in internal security in Russia. The final one and the weakest part of what we call the Clausewitzian Trinity is the military. If the military either stop fighting or are incapable of fighting, then the war will end. They just will run out of combat power. And really, he's been plugging gaps with the mobilization of the 300,000 people. There could be more. And that is part of his short-term strategy of using those people to shore up, hold terrain as the winter comes, and then hope that other things play out in the West, which will lead to people wanting to go towards a posture of diplomacy. Now, from a Ukrainian perspective, the best diplomacy is victory, and you don't want to blunt their momentum at the moment.
Absolutely. And so we talked about what this means on the Russian side. What does this mean from the Ukrainian side?
Well, momentum is a great thing in when you're fighting, but also I think on the political context, and you've got to always remember that wars are fought for political objectives. And I thought what was really interesting this week was Macron really parroting the same objectives as Zelensky in terms of what the 5 outcomes should be. And that is, of course, restoring territorial integrity. That is, the Russians must withdraw to the pre-1991 borders, respecting the UN statutes, reparations following damages, and they're over 100 billion at the moment, punishing Russian war criminals. We can't see that really happening. And guaranteeing this won't happen again. That is, that you give Ukraine security guarantees for the future. So Macron and really the G7 are saying that those things must happen for a just peace to happen.
And it feels like the alliance supporting Ukraine is very, very strong, and everybody will be buoyed up by this latest development. But it doesn't mean that, this is over as far as the Russians are concerned, as humiliating as this is for President Putin. What do you see happening next in terms of the Russian strategy?
Well, the Russian strategy is really a sort of wait and hold in a number of ways. The first one is to continue the sort of energy warfare, both against Ukraine and the West. That is the missile terrorism. We know that sort of 30 or 40% of the infrastructure of Ukraine has been knocked out. Now, that is very reminiscent of the Casablanca directive in World War II, the sort of carpet bombing of Germany, which did not break the will of the Germans, and neither will this break the will of the Ukrainians. The second thing is that he must shore up his rear operations. And that is, martial law could already be declared in those areas nearest to the border to prevent that sort of civil uprising should there be a mass there. But it's really holding territory, trying to say that this is NATO that we're fighting against, not Ukraine, and hoping, therefore, that ultimately, after the winter, some sort of Ukraine fatigue falls into place in the West. Now, actually, if you were a Russian, the worst thing that happened this week alongside Kherson is actually the midterm election result in America, because there was quite a lot there that I think Putin was gambling on, and he probably did try and do something within the election to try and reverse the blue part of the House to a red part. That's very, very important in terms of the fringe elements, particularly of the Republican Party with your sort of Marjorie Taylor Greens and the sort of we should not support Ukraine.
And Chip, what about what actions Russia may take against individual countries supporting Ukraine in the West, particularly us here in the United Kingdom? I presume Putin and the Kremlin will be looking at the financial pressures because of the inflation crisis. They'll be looking at the general levels of unrest in the country. What should we be preparing ourselves for, if anything, from Russia?
Well, I think there'll be more hybrid warfare from the Russians, particularly in terms of the energy infrastructure in the West. It is the sort of Nord Stream 2 and the supplies from sort of Norway and things like that that he might try and go after. Now, because of Nord Stream 2, we are sort of aware of all that. And, that's another losing card ultimately that he's played, the sort of energy card in Europe in terms of the amount of supplies that there are now and the alternative supplies that we've got from around the world, including, Norway, Qatar, Algeria. I mean that, the reservoirs are full in Europe at the moment with a fairly benign weather patterns at the moment. So we're not going to run out of energy. The price of energy may be different, but he will still try these sort of hybrid things. There are still ways he can escalate. There might be more cyber attacks, although you could argue that cyber has been one of those things that everyone thought was going to be the new way of domain of warfare that would alter things, and it really hasn't. And if you are resilient in your sort of cyber operations, it may not be as effective as we thought. Ultimately, warfare, may have a new character, but the nature of it doesn't change, and that's why we've seen huge casualties on both sides.
And of course, there was the rather outlandish accusations that it was British naval officers or that had attacked the Nord Stream. So there was sort of wild misinformation as well.
Yeah, and part of that is, of course, for the domestic audience. We're one of the major players in NATO. NATO is supporting the Ukrainians. Let's smack the Brits because that would play well in our domestic audience. We'll see a lot more of that. Now, actually, NATO is not really mobilised at all. So we've given them the weapons. So if he really wanted to take on NATO, he would have real problems. And that is why, of course, he's not attacked the countries which border Russia and are part of this Ruskaya Mir concept, the Lithuanias, Latvia, Estonia and Poland. None of those like Russia because they've all been invaded in the past by them.